Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the Robert E. Howard Show. It's time for the Robert E. Howard Show once again. And today in the Robert E. Howard Show, we're going into the past. We're not literally going into the past, although we could, because Roger's got a time machine. But we're not using your time machine today, Roger. Every time we use his time machine, we mess up the timeline. And we don't want to do that anymore because things are bad enough, Roger. So we're just going to be talking about a book from the past, which was a pretty important book to me when I found it, because it was one of the things that made me the Robert E. Howard fan that I am today. I had already read Almeric, which was the first Robert E. Howard book I'd ever read. And I read all of the Conan stories that were in the Ace line of Conan books, which were edited by L. Sprague de Camp, which unfortunately during the 1980s was the only way you could read Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. So I already was a fan of Robert E. Howard from Conan, but then I found this book in a used bookstore. Probably I found this in 1986 or 1987, somewhere around there. That feels right. It was a long time ago. It's hard to remember. But somewhere around that time, I found this book, Wolfshead, by Robert E. Howard. And according to the awesomeness up at the top there, from the smoldering fires of hell itself, evil unleashes a new reign of horror. So that probably would have made me buy it anyway. But it was written by Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan. So of course I had to get it. Because I had never read any of Robert E. Howard's stories other than the Conan stories and Almeric. That was it. As far as I knew, that's all he wrote. Because at the time, I only knew Robert E. Howard from Conan and from the Conan comic book. And then I found this. And it was awesome. So this is a book that was published by Bantam Books in 1979. So it was already old when I got it, although not that old. And it's interesting in a few ways. It's a really great collection of Robert E. Howard's fantasy and horror stories. And I remember being kind of surprised that Robert E. Howard wrote horror, because I only knew him really as a sword and sorcery writer. Almeric, even though it took place on another planet, was basically a sword and sorcery story. Where in this, you had some genuine horror stories. But they were in Robert E. Howard's distinct style. So that was really cool. This was a great discovery. It was interesting also because of the introduction. So personally, I felt at the time, I'm sure, and I feel now that Robert E. Howard's Conan stories are the best series of stories that Robert E. Howard did. I love all of Robert E. Howard's work, but I love his Conan stories. The author of the introduction to this book felt differently, which is kind of an interesting thing. The introduction to this book was written by Robert Bloch. And Robert Bloch, who is known now as the author of Psycho. I think that's pretty much what Bloch is remembered for now. But Robert Bloch wrote a ton of pulp stories, a lot. He started out in Weird Tales along with Robert E. Howard. He corresponded with H.P. Lovecraft, like Howard did. And he was a young writer at the time when he started. And Robert E. Howard was already established in Weird Tales and was very popular in Weird Tales. And Robert Bloch, in the letters pages of Weird Tales, insulted Conan. He said basically, do we have to keep reading these crappy Conan stories that Robert E. Howard keeps churning out? He was not a fan of Conan, which angered a lot of people. And Robert Bloch wrote this letter before his own first story was published, if I'm remembering right. it was around that time. And it was probably a mistake on Bloch's part to criticize such a popular character and such a popular writer in Weird Tales, because, of course, many readers rose to Robert E. Howard's defense. And I will read you just a little bit of the introduction here, the first page of the introduction. That sound you hear is probably Kirk Mashburn turning over in his grave. I assume, of course, that he is dead. Well over 40 years have passed since Mr. Mashburn, a distinguished contributor to Weird Tales magazine, wrote to the letter column and denounced me for criticizing the work of fellow author Robert E. Howard. And here I am today writing an introduction to a volume of Howard's stories. Actually, it's not all that strange. I could easily have written such an introduction even then, for my youthfully intemperate remarks were directed at Howard's Conan series, which I deemed inferior to his other work. It was my feeling that his talent was best employed in tales such as The Valley of the Worm and similar material represented in this present volume. So, the Conan stories were not to Robert Bloch's taste. He preferred the darker fantasy and horror stories that Robert E. Howard wrote. Although Conan is full of, monsters, and there's a lot of horror in Conan. That's part of what makes Sword and Sorcery what it is. But there are a lot of straight horror stories in here, as well as fantasy, and it's a great collection. It's fantastic. All of these stories, or most of these stories, I believe, have been reprinted in the Del Rey edition of The Best Stories of Robert E. Howard, which you should get if you don't already have. But at the time, these were not easy to get. This is the book that really made me start searching for other Robert E. Howard books, because I just did not realize before I found this book that Robert E. Howard wrote other stuff. And after this, I started looking around, and I kept finding other paperbacks that had been printed in the 1970s for the most part. And for years, when I was a teenager and in my 20s, I would just haunt the used bookstores looking for Robert E. Howard paperbacks. And I found some great stuff. Most of that stuff I still have. Like this one. This is the copy I picked up in 86 or 87. So that in itself makes this book important to me, because this kind of opened up the world of Robert E. Howard's other writing other than Conan for me. Because at the time, there was no internet. And I was at the time reading the Conan comic book, but I couldn't always get Savage Sword of Conan. If I had read a lot of those earlier issues of Savage Sword of Conan, I would have known more about Robert E. Howard's writing, because there were a lot of articles in Savage Sword of Conan talking about the other things that Robert E. Howard wrote. But at the time that those were being printed, I wasn't able to get those issues. And there were fewer of those kinds of articles in Savage Sword of Conan by the mid-'80s, I think, when I was really reading it. So this book, what's in this book anyway? Well, the illustration on the cover is not from Wolfshead. That is from the Black Stone. And it's an awesome cover, although I don't know who did it, because when I check the title page, or the page here, it just says cover art copyright 1979 by Bantam Books. And so I don't really know who did the cover. Somebody does, though. Somebody out there knows who did this cover. So tell me who did this cover, because it's awesome and I'd like to know. But the first story in here is The Black Stone, which is a straight up horror story influenced by H.P. Lovecraft's writings, like a lot of Robert E. Howard's horror stories were. But this, I think, was his most successful Lovecraftian kind of story. It's a really dark, grisly, and frankly frightening horror story. Really, really good. which is why The Black Stone is one of Robert E. Howard's horror stories that tends to be anthologized in horror anthologies, when he's anthologized in horror anthologies. The Black Stone very often is the story that is anthologized, along with Pigeons from Hell and a couple others. But The Black Stone is considered one of Robert E. Howard's best. And I think it is one of his best. But there's other stuff in here as well. Of course, there is The Valley of the Worm, which has also been mentioned, which is a fantasy story. It's a dark fantasy story involving a giant monster. And it's great. The Valley of the Worm is great. Just an awesome story. And then we have Wolfshead, which is a werewolf story. And werewolves have always been my favorite monster. So, of course, I was thrilled when I read Wolfshead and realized it was a werewolf story. I was always up for those. And this was a good one. It was a sequel to another werewolf story, but Wolfshead proved to be more popular. And Wolfshead was his first real success. It was published in 1926. So it's the oldest story in this volume. And it was the first story, if I'm remembering right, that earned him the cover spot on Weird Tales. And it's excellent. It deserves it. He wasn't the writer at this point that he became. He became a much better writer the more he wrote. But it was excellent. I really liked it. Then we have The Fire of Ashurbanipal, which is kind of an adventure horror story, which is really good. Same with House of Arabu. And then we have, to close out this slim volume, The Horror from the Mound. The Horror from the Mound, which is a vampire story, which made it equally awesome because now we had a werewolf story and now we have a vampire story, which was really an interesting one. Because it's a vampire story, but it's also a weird Western as well. It takes place in the Old West. And it's really good. It's very pulpy. It's a straight up pulp horror story, which I love. So I thought it was fantastic, and I still really like it. So this is a rock solid collection of fantasy and fantasy horror stories. And it really opened my eyes to the other things that Robert E. Howard wrote. And it's wonderful. And so I just thought I would drag it out and reminisce about this book. If you ever find it lying around, it's great. Pick it up. I don't know how available it is now. You know, back when I was searching out these Robert E. Howard books and finding them in old used bookstores, they were easier to find, I think, than they are now. A lot more time has passed. And fortunately, a lot more people are becoming interested in Robert E. Howard nowadays. And so the easiest place to find this is probably on eBay. I imagine it's not too expensive. I can't imagine it would be. But it's excellent. Excellent old book from 1979 with an introduction by Robert Bloch, who didn't like Conan, but liked this other stuff. And it's cool. So there you go. Wolfshead. I will catch you next time.